Alrighty, hello everyone. This week's readings focused on international economic organizations and development, and focused on some fundamentals like the rise and collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the introduction of the three pillars and their institutional mediums, and understanding when and why countries deem it necessary to ask for help from the IMF. There are numerous factors that come into play regarding the establishment of these institutions and their historical relationship with the international system and the many different countries in play. Understanding the context of cultural, political, and social factors that make up the identity of these different countries helps to better understand how the international system is currently shaped. The US has been heavily involved directly and financially, but also through soft power and affiliation. As globalization as an ideology became more prominent, starting in the 1970s, the world has seen deregulation and free trade grow globally, which has become a focal point in its own. Some posit this as the main issue with globalization, as it has hurt many more countries domestically and made the richer rich and the poorer poor. For my case study this week, I looked at how Mexico has been affected by the IMF since the start of its relationship in the 1940s, days after the IMF's creation, and then through the multiple financial crises in the 80s, 90s, and late 2000s. In addition, I looked at personal security and basic rights, such as healthcare, and whether it is deemed as state services, its accessibility and tangibility, and why that may be in lieu of globalization and Mexico's relationship with the IMF and World Bank. IMF programs require an agreement between the IMF and a borrowing country. While some scholars are increasingly interested in understanding the IMF's decision-making, usually within the principal agent framework, they tend to focus their attention on studies that concentrate on explaining the government's decisions. As we indicated earlier, needing to know cultural, political, and social history as context is crucial when identifying an approach or lens to understanding the framework. Earlier works on IMF program participation have identified the main indicators of economic distress associated with the need for IMF help, and more recent studies emphasize the domestic political considerations associated with heeding these economic distress signals, which Dr. Sun mentioned this week. In countries that have outstanding debts to other foreign investors or entities, state governments often have an issue with appropriating the correct amount of IMF and World Bank loans and bailout currency to pay off foreign investors, investments, and entities rather than being invested and circulated back into their own state economy. The rapid, externally imposed economic liberalization of the type insisted upon by the International Monetary Fund has led to increased government violations of personal security rights. This is a direct quote from this week's readings, and it's reflected by the Mexican government's decisions in the 80s and 90s. The Mexican debt crisis began in 1982 due to foreign indebtedness via defaulting on foreign debt. Mexico was told by the IMF that they would be granted currency loans, but that this would be used to repay foreign investors, commercial banks, and private banks. These structural adjustment agreements plummeted the national currency, although nationalizing previously private banks, and the people were not told that these loans would be used to pay back the foreign investors. Because of this, the initial debt was due to terms decided by the Bank of England, IMF, and U.S. Federal Treasury. All of these measures implemented on Mexico by the IMF and World Bank in exchange for financial help led to what some people will see as a globalization being used to make the richer rich and, again, the poorer poor, rather than the stated initiatives by these organizations and their programs. Mexico's leadership rapidly implemented every structural adjustment policy provided by the IMF and the WBO until the peso crisis and subsequent economic collapse in 1994. Also, which eventually led to the aforementioned violations of personal security during this time, such as an inaccessibility of healthcare. Dr. Sun mentions that so often the IMF is seen as some evil organization from the West to take over undeveloped countries, making poor people's lives even worse, rather than promoting development and growth and free trade and many positive aspects of globalization ideology. In the case of Mexico in the 1980s, these SAAs imposed on countries working with IMF programs ended up limiting and reducing access of social services by lack of public spending. In addition, the effects of globalization were felt through these programs by increasing state privatization of public services, increasing world market free trade, which removed these foreign investment barriers, and increased trade liberalization, which reduced the domestic value. The violation of personal security due to these structural adjustment policies can be understood through the privatization of health service and loans given by the World Bank to Mexico. Mexico's public expenditures rapidly lessened, facing budget cuts that further disintegrated state healthcare services, increased comparative wages, which lowered unemployment rates, and more, all affecting the security of vulnerable Mexican citizens due to the supposedly helpful IMF loans, policies, and programs. Mexico received a bailout package in 1995 from the IMF, and in 1997 they used loans from the World Bank to privatize Social Security in the country, leading to some of these aforementioned budget reductions, the reduction of healthcare services, and subsequently leading to unemployment increasing by millions. Stiglitz's reading this week acknowledged a similar perception to that of Abuharb and Cingranelli. He posits that fiscal austerity, privatization, and market liberalization are all parts of policy that become the ends themselves, rather than the means to more equitable and sustainable growth. In the case study of Mexico, these similar scholarly thought processes are important as they help posit the idea that maybe these reforms created by the Mexican government in partnership with the IMF and World Bank SAPs have not truly increased, closing the gap on health inequities and providing the Mexican people with the access to healthcare services they need. Although some defenders of these international institutions might say that the social protection system and health project was a turning point for Mexicans domestically in the early 2000s, the World Bank has only contributed partially to funding. Seguro Popular was unofficially established in 2002 and officially solidified in 2013 as part of the official project. Seguro Popular is a Mexican health insurance program open to the public and allowing coverage of access of many basic health services, and was established by the Mexican government to reduce the gap in health inequity due to the fallout of the loans and the SAPs by the IMF and World Bank. In conclusion, it's clear to see that in the case study of Mexico, the policies and measures implemented by these pillars of the current global economic system indicate that Mexico became part of an economic and financial cycle, stuck needing to borrow and take loans in order to create their own individual sustainable economic growth. It's unclear whether without the initial crises in the 80s and 90s, whether Mexico would have needed the same financial support. However, without the financial support of these institutions, the amount of access to healthcare and general health services may not have been much, nor the services and resources be advanced without the globalization ideology that the IMF and World Bank insist upon. It is crucial for Mexico to create increased, self-sustainable financial and economic growth to continue decreasing the gap in health inequity and healthcare services offered to the vulnerable population of Mexicans in need. To do this, they must work with some of the tenets of modern globalization while continuing to increase self-sufficiency.